Welcome, everyone, to this important conversation that honors Asian American Pacific Island Heritage Month. As part of our larger community of scholar practitioners, Fielding, as you all know, is deeply committed to opening more spaces and opportunities for discussions that both accurately reflect the growing diversity of our society, provide ways to consider multiple perspectives. So as we gather, as people are being admitted into the room, I just wanted to welcome you all to this important day and this discussion. And this discussion today is sponsored by our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this is one such space. The United States of America, like many countries, has been shaped by many peoples and through their labor often. And often this was free labor, such as with slavery, and also by immigrant labor, often exploited. I thought about this as I began to reflect more upon this particular month and the group of peoples that we are honoring this month. In my own hometown community of Flagstaff, Arizona, there are Asian American communities there that have been there for generations since the founding of the town in 1886, mostly arriving as railroad workers to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. And it's always interesting to me, as a person who is trained as a historian, how deeply ahistorical we can be about the understanding of our nation and the history of our nation as it relates to diversity. So as we honor the diverse cultures and traditions of the AAPI community today, let us not forget the many ways that AAPI, often marginalized, have made major contributions to our society. Fielding's headquarters in Santa Barbara, for example, as well as in our own community member neighborhoods around the world, have a vibrant Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And we recognize and at Fielding, uplift our students and support our students, alum, faculty, staff, and others who help make Fielding a special place, as well as a place with range and depth dedicated to social justice for all, and includes our focus on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. For the second year in a row, this is the second time with the leadership of Dr. Davis Whiteeyes, we're hosting this event today, and I just want to thank the speakers in advance for the discussions that I know will be rich and robust. In addition, over the course of this past year, when the tragic shootings took place last February in California, Dr. Davis Whiteeyes and our 3 practice circle members held a community conversation to support those affected by the tragedy. Our own Fielding Staff Council held an AAPI coffee chat today for Fielding colleagues earlier this afternoon. Just another indication of the ways in which we open up these conversational spaces. So as we think about a future that's better than the past, let us remember that all of us can take action right now to address diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for our AAPI community, as well as others. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the ongoing discrimination and injustices experienced by AAPI individuals, especially in the wake of growing and recent hate crimes and acts of violence. And so we can take time during this hour and after it to recognize and celebrate the many achievements and contributions of the AAPI community as individuals and also in solidarity with each other. And let us help amplify narratives and advocate for justice. And this is so crucial that as graduate educators and learners that we have these deeper cultural perspectives and understanding that help us when we are out there in the world in our practice and in our research and our scholarship, help us promote a more equitable, just society and continue to respect the unique identity of all individuals. So today's speaker will shed light on what it means to explore how organization and institutions can do better to support AAPI individuals and raise awareness of issues within the specific community. I know that we will learn much today, as we always do when Fielding colleagues gather together. And let's also use this as a moment of reflection in our professional practices and in our daily lives. And thank you to our speakers for being here and for your expertise, insights, and contributions to this event. into the AAPI community. And while I can't see all the participants on the call, I know our board chair, Karen Bogart, is with us today, also a Fielding graduate. Thank you for being here. Our program leader of our media psychology program, Brian Cutler, is here as well. And one of our gracious and generous supporters, Dr. Marjorie Wu, Fielding alum, who has helped us build a coaching program in the Shanghai area. And I'm sure there are others that I will be able to acknowledge during the time that we're together who may be joining late or may have joined after I looked at the participant list. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Dr. Allison Davis Whiteeyes, for both the global land acknowledgement and to introduce our speakers. Looking forward to what we can learn today, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, President Rogers, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this DEI critical conversation, New Dimensions in the AAPI Experience, discussions with AAPI leaders, scholars, and practitioners. Again, my name is Allison Davis Whiteeyes, and I serve as the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Fielding. And at this time, I would like to welcome you with an opening land acknowledgement that will center more on the importance of relationality, solidarity building, which is an Indigenous concept and moral precept to ground our work together as a collective community. So please join me by dropping in the chat the lands upon which you reside and the Indigenous homelands that you're identified with, whether you're a member of an Indigenous community or if you're just residing on Indigenous lands. I've dropped in the chat nativeland.ca if you need to locate where you are currently. And please put that in the chat. The Fielding Global Indigenous Peoples Acknowledgement is more than a call for action than a statement. It is about a collective community that is committed to deepening our relationships and understandings of Indigenous peoples worldwide through promoting educational opportunities in partnership with Indigenous peoples worldwide. It's also about us building cooperations and consulting in good faith with Indigenous peoples through their own representative institutions in order to provide opportunities for knowledge production or any other. It's also by protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples by actively promoting the scholarship of these communities through the Fielding University Press to advance knowledge and provide venues for knowledge production and dissemination. It's also about recognizing and acknowledging that traditional knowledge cannot be separated from natural and cultural resources. And as such, all Indigenous knowledge should be protected and respected. And last but not least, it is important for us as the Fielding community to center Indigenous communities, knowledge, traditions, and worldviews in order to enhance the next generation of world Indigenous leadership committed to building a more just and sustainable world. Thank you for allowing me to take this time to share our global land acknowledgements. And now I would like to introduce to you our amazing guests for today. I will start with Joe Wahl, who has 30 years experience as a regional and national diversity inclusion leader. Joe founded Wahl and Associates in 2017. He brings deep experience and expertise assisting best-in-class organizations in the areas of executive selection, leadership, and board development, all through an equity lens. He is committed and passionate about helping organizations align and demonstrate the values of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Joe and I have served personally on many committees together, and I want to let everyone know that he was one of the founders and served as chair emeritus of Partners in Diversity, a nationally recognized organization which assists employers in the Pacific Northwest recruit and retain a more diverse workforce. His community involvement includes service as past president of the Portland Japanese American Citizens League, past president of the Oregon Buddhist Temple, and a founding board member of the Oregon Nikkei Endowment. He currently sits on the University of Oregon's Alumni Association Board, as well as the University of Oregon's President's Diversity Advisory Council. Thank you for joining us today, Joe Wahl. Along with Joe Wahl, we have Dr. Dolly Bach Nguyen. Dr. Bach Mai Dolly Nguyen is an assistant professor of education at Oregon State University. Her research examines the relationship between social categorization and inequality in education, with a particular attention paid to racial and organizational classifications. These foci have manifested in studies on minority-serving institutions, what many of us know as MSIs, their ethnic stratification and organizational behavior. Her research has been published in the American Educational Research Journal, the Review of Research in Education, and the Review of Higher Education. And she is currently supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Spencer Foundation. Dr. Bach Nguyen is currently writing her first book under contract with University of Chicago Press on how higher education organizations at the intersection of two MSI, minority serving institution, designations navigate racialized tensions, enact widespread cultural ideals or myths, and give life to unique organizational frames of racial equity. And last but not least, I'd love to introduce to you Dr. Kanthi Raja, who is also an alum of Fielding Graduate University. Dr. Raja is a licensed psychologist in New York. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Fielding in 2021. She completed her APA accredited doctoral internship at SUNY Stony Brook in Stony Brook, New York. And Dr. Raja also holds a master's degree in social work from Case Western University and has worked as a clinical social worker for over 20 years prior to obtaining her doctorate. During her time as a mental health professional, Dr. Raja worked in a variety of settings that provide services to underserved populations, including children, adolescents, families, couples, and adults. She has received specialized training in trauma, as well as parent-child relationships. She is very interested in meeting the mental health needs of women, particularly as they relate to the intersections of attachment, culture, and identity. So with that wonderful introduction of some amazing colleagues, scholars, and leaders in their community, I'm going to open up with this first question. And since our first question focuses on identity and understanding who you are, right, in terms of space, place, and time in the United States, I would like to invite our panelists to share about yourself. Where did you grow up? How do you understand being Asian in the current American discourse of race and identity? And I think I will start with you, Dr. Raja, because you had made mention early on that you are a second-generation South Asian American. Can you share a little bit about that and what that means to you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I feel very grateful and honored to join my colleagues in this discussion to talk about the needs of the AAPI population in the United States. So as a clinical psychologist and South Asian American, I really hope to represent the voices of South Asian Americans, specifically as related to managing concerns related to mental health, and which are also related to experiences in countries of origin, as well as immigration. And my comments will reflect the experiences I hear shared by South Asian American women who I interview in my research, as well as the many South Asian American clients of all genders I work with in my therapy practices. So I do identify as a second-generation South Asian American. My father came to the United States from India in the mid-1950s for his medical training, and later came back with my mother towards the mid to late 1960s. So my parents, similar to many other South Asian immigrants, came to the United States in search of professional growth experiences in a country that they perceived as welcoming, open, and fostering innovation. Both of my parents experienced racism related to colorism, xenophobia, and colonial mentality. These experiences began in the mid-1950s when my father first arrived and extended well into the 1980s. So despite the strong messaging they received that holding on to their values and belief systems would come at a cost, they were not willing to sacrifice elements of their Indian heritage, which included religion, culture, values, and belief system. So growing up in middle-class families in India, they both felt deep gratitude, loyalty, and respect for their own personal histories, And so they brought these elements along with our regular vacations to visit our extended family in India. So I pretty much grew up a middle-class lifestyle in Midwestern America in the Midwestern public school system. So this environment had many challenges of its own, including racism and expectations of the white majority. As a result, I can describe my life experiences as being in between two cultures, several religions, several languages. I was exposed to two vastly different value and belief systems with the expectations that I adhere to the one Indian Hindu system. However, we cannot preclude ourselves from being influenced by other belief systems as well. So as a result, I see being Asian in the United States as multidimensional. I believe I hold a bicultural identity. And I believe this multidimensional identity is unique to each individual. So holding deep gratitude and respect for my parents' experiences, as well as my extended families and ancestors, I believe I've crafted my own bicultural identity, emphasizing certain values while tweaking others to fit our changing times. I am not alone in these experiences. These are shared by many South Asian Americans in the United States, especially South Asian American women. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. Let's kind of pivot over here to Dr. Nguyen. Do you think you can respond to that and share a little bit about yourself and your understanding of being Asian in the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. I can definitely empathize with a lot of those perspectives, though the slight variation. I grew up in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. If you're familiar with Portland, it's one of the widest metropolitan cities in the United States. And if you can believe it, the suburbs even wider. And so I think my proximity to whiteness has definitely shaped my views of race and Asian Americanhood. My parents came over. I'm second generation Vietnamese American. My parents came from Vietnam as boat people in '79. And I'm first generation in terms of my college going. And so I think all of that shapes how I will subsequently respond to the following questions, and you'll see that illuminated in my responses. But other than that, I can say I certainly echo Dr. Raja's view of my work being in honor of my parents' unrivaled strength and resilience. My success is certainly on their coattails, and I'm thrilled to be here to share some of my thoughts with you.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. And Joe Wahl, your experiences.
Certainly. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Allison and my esteemed colleagues. The experience of Asian Americans, I think, our different experiences really highlight the diversity within our API communities. So many times we're looked upon as a monolith. And the reality is that the diversity within the API community is so diverse, and it's been highlighted most recently, obviously, with issues that surround immigration that continue to really impact those of us that even if we've been here for generations, and I think my own experience, my father was American, stationed in Japan after World War II, met my mother there who's from Japan. And so my sister and I are both biracial. And they decided at an early time that they would raise my sister and I in the United States because many people didn't realize how discriminatory Japanese society was, especially after World War II, to biracial children. And so my father was from Oregon. And so when he got lung cancer and ended up passing away, my mother moved my sister and I to Seaside, Oregon, on the North Oregon coast. It's a very small town. For most of the time I was growing up there, we were the only family of color. And, as Donna has mentioned, we're not only here in the Northwest and around Portland area, the whitest big city in America. You go to the smaller towns and it's even more of an issue. I grew up not really having an Asian American identity. and thought that I was pretty much the all-American boy. But my mother had always instilled in me a sense of achievement that I needed to do better than anyone else. And so I was an athlete. I was a student body president, ended up going to the U.S. Naval Academy after high school. And it was there that I ended up running into other Asian American midshipmen. At that time, the Naval Academy was still all men. And we started to share some of our experiences, and there were some common experiences that I was surprised that I recognized, like longing for Asian food that we couldn't find in Annapolis, Maryland at that time in the late 70s. But it wasn't until I got to the University of Oregon after I left the Naval Academy that I started to realize that there was a part of me that I had totally missed, and that was learning about Asian American history. And I so appreciate, President Rogers, your reference to history and how important that is, and how many of us grew up not knowing the history of Asian Americans, particularly if it was not appropriate or not respected, in the mainstream American, ethos. And that was certainly the case of Japanese Americans and the incarceration during World War II, which I learned about when I was at the Naval Academy. So you can imagine, or at the University of Oregon. So you can imagine, I'm in my 20s and I'm just learning this, that I became an angry activist. But this was where I began to really learn about my own Asian American identity and history, to the point I actually changed my name legally to adopt because I wasn't born with a Japanese name or reference to my Japanese identity. And so I actually had my name legally changed during college to reflect my mother's family name and reclaim part of that Asian American identity. And that experience really shaped the rest of my career, where I've been involved, as Allison has mentioned, in DEI work all that time. At the time, we didn't know that it was going to be called, DEI, but it was really about cultural identity at that time. And since that time, it's really helped shape my life and my career. And, as I move forward, and even being half, Asian American, half Japanese American, that is what I identify as. And it's what's really shaped, again, my life and my career moving forward. And I think, as our other participants have said, this is such an important conversation. I just heard this morning on Good Morning America, a young Korean American author who just wrote a book called Crying at H Mart. And it's about her experiences growing up, not knowing and kind of coming to grips after her Korean mother passed away, with her own identity, in America. And for those of us that are biracial, I think it's another compelling challenge that we have to deal with in the midst of the other challenges that we'll talk about further here, with the challenges that the API community is facing. So thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Joe. So happy to have you join us. And it's a great segue to that question. What are some of the current challenges facing the API community? And I think what I'll do is I'll pivot right now to Dr. Nguyen. We'll have you start that off. What do you identify as some of the current challenges facing the API community?
Thanks, Allison. I think that a challenge for the API community, there are a number of concrete challenges we can talk about, and I'm sure will arise in this panel. But I think central to that is what is a more theoretical issue about how Asians and Asian Americans are understood in the national discourse on race. It's something that I've been saying recently in presentations, is that how can we be all things and yet nothing? So let me give you an example. Asian Americans are considered aggressive tiger moms who unwaveringly put success over care. And Asian American women are also docile and subservient partners who never speak our minds. We are exoticized fantasies for male pleasure and viral plagues to be avoided at all costs. We are untrustworthy, manipulative masterminds and emasculated dopes. We are high achieving elites who take up all the seats in college, and foreigners who can't speak English or understand social norms. We're the most satisfied racial group with among the highest rates of suicide. We're crazy rich and work in the lowest paying service industries. How are those things all possible? I think it's really easy to suggest that the reason why that is possible is because Asian Americans are invisible. And you may hear this a lot in the mainstream discourse, but I think that there is a richer theoretical underpinning here that puts us in these positions of juxtaposition, which is that Asian Americans are leveraged as a racial group in as needed to make the case for other racial groups. So if you study race, you often hear that you can't understand race unless you understand relationality, right? We can't understand one group without another group as a point of reference. I would argue that the biggest issue facing Asian Americans is that we are the point of reference all of the time, which makes it possible that we are everything and nothing. We are the reason why other people can't get into college. We are the reason why other racial minorities can't get services. We are the reason why a lot of dominant racial understandings are possible because of where we are positioned in the broader racial hierarchy. And so what that produces, tangibly speaking, is that Asian Americans can have the highest enrollment in higher education, especially in elite universities, but also the largest growing proportion of enrollment that begins in community colleges. Asian Americans major in STEM in the largest proportions and in other selective types of programs in undergraduate education, but have among the highest rates of mental health concerns. Asian Americans graduate with the most advanced degrees of any other racial group, but are the most divided racial group educationally and economically. Asian Americans easily secure the highest earning jobs, even more so than their white peers, and yet are the least likely to be promoted into management. So I would say that those juxtapositions and relatedly our position in how race is understood relationally is the largest challenge we face. And I'll later offer some insights on how we think about that and what we can do about it.
It's a great segue over to Dr. Raja and mental health. Are there other challenges, mental health or others, that you would like to highlight?
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Nguyen, thank you so much for summarizing. That was a beautiful summary of, I think, all aspects of the AAPI experience. So I agree with everything Dr. Nguyen shared. And I think I'd like to add that to go along with the idea of we're not understood. I think people don't understand that we experience discrimination and this in terms of the same constructs as other racial and ethnic minority groups, but the way we experience it is very unique and is very much based on our history in our countries of origin and what our families and extended families have gone through. In terms of South Asian Americans, history of colonialism, the partition of South Asia, intergenerational neglect of mental health concerns, very, very gendered social and role expectations, as well as stereotypes of who South Asian American people are, very much contribute to this experience. I would also like to highlight the model minority myth that Dr. Nguyen mentioned. Embedded in our value system, we have values such as respect for authority, a very strong work ethic, value of education. And because of the model minority myth, these values sort of become weaponized and we become pitted against each other as well as other racial and ethnic groups. I think most notably, it's pitted South Asian Americans against Black Americans and has really sort of infused anti-Blackness into South Asian American culture, which we are now trying to undo the effects of that. Young persons of South Asian origin are really at a loss when they leave their communities and enter either organizations, universities, or professional spaces, because they don't know how to navigate these very white-centered spaces. And those who sort of disavow the rules of their communities of origin are doubly disadvantaged because they face discrimination both from within their communities as well as outside of their communities. We don't have enough spaces available for people of Asian origin to feel accepted and safe and supported. And all of these things really exacerbate both pre-existing mental health concerns as well as new mental health concerns that they experience. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. I know that we have about 30 minutes left, and I want to give Joe Wahl a few minutes to share what he sees as challenges. And perhaps if we could be brief, because we want to move to solutions and then open up to questions. So, Joe?
Absolutely. And thank you for my colleagues for really summarizing. I think if we look at these, the real high level, areas and challenges that the communities are facing, it comes down to income disparities, as we've heard about. We have some of the best incomes, and yet there are over 2 million, API families who are living under the poverty line. Right. And at this same time, we're looking at leadership gaps. We're some of the highest educated, and yet if we look in organizations where we might be, like in the technology arena, where we might be very well represented, we have very few individuals at the highest levels of leadership. So why is that? Right. And then, as we've talked about, stress, and stress is really a result of the expectations that have been placed upon individuals, and then that we place upon ourselves as well. And that comes from a myriad of different areas that my colleagues have alluded to. So I think those are the main things, and I would love to us to get to kind of the solutions part. But from my role in running a consulting firm, and we work with nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, and we really see how this plays out within the organizational structure, in organizations where the lack of representation has really made an impact. And I think that's one of the things that we're hoping that we'll talk a little bit about in our next section on, as we kind of pivot into solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And yes, I'll pick up on that thread and ask this question. So how do we address these challenges? What is being done that you find innovative or helpful? And what can organizations and institutions do different or better in support of AAPI community members? And I'm going to start with Dr. Nguyen.
Thanks. I think I'll maybe take from where Joe left off on representation. So let's say we hired a bunch of Asian Americans across like our higher education organizations, corporations. Let's say we actually made a bunch of them CEO. Do we think that that would resolve the problems related to racial inequality for Asian Americans? I surmise no. And that largely is given that Asian Americans, as I mentioned earlier, have a proximity to whiteness, which is associated with the notions of universal success and how that universal success is gained in the American context of privilege, of elitism, and of capitalism. So that is possible because, as I mentioned earlier, Asian Americans are all things and nothing, which also makes it possible that Asian Americans are minorities in one context and non-minorities in another. So who are we? So in terms of solutions then, I think it's absolutely vital that organizations and individuals, us as individuals, practitioners, and leaders, recognize and include Asians and Asian Americans in definitions of underrepresented minorities. And that's the case even if Asian Americans and Asians are overwhelmingly enrolled in your college because if they're not underrepresented, there is the possibility, almost a certain possibility, that Asian Americans continue to be underserved. That leads me to my second point. I think it's absolutely vital that support programs specifically are developed for Asian Americans, because when that is not the case, it is too easy, and oftentimes these circumstances that Asian Americans are left out of opportunities to access scholarships, to be supported in professional development, or to otherwise access resources that are necessary to resolve the inequalities that the community faces. And then finally, you'll hear that it's necessary to collect disaggregated data on Asian Americans, given the wide diversity of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And I'll acknowledge very quickly here that we have not even taken a moment to stop and talk about Pacific Islanders, which truthfully should be its own panel, because we cannot do service for Pacific Islander communities by grouping all together, hence the need for disaggregated data. But I'll say, beyond disaggregated data, like that ship has sailed. We need to just do it. I don't think it needs to be rationalized any further. Rather, thinking very intentionally about how to use disaggregated data meaningfully, such that it reshapes policy and practices around how Asian Americans are envisioned in the racial discourse. And finally, the most instructive recommendation or solution I would offer is we need to be honest. We as individuals, leaders, those in education, we need to be really honest about why Asian Americans continue to be left out of the racial discourse on racial inequality.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. Those are very powerful and motivating questions, and I'm hoping that we can have that conversation in this session. I'm going to move to Joe Wahl because you seemed very excited to share some of your thoughts around what organizations could do, and you work with a number of organizations.
We do. Thank you. And Dolly, thank you so much for talking about disaggregating data, because it is such a critical part of the work that we do and trying to kind of advance any of this work forward. When I look at some potential solutions, I think they come down to awareness, education, and engagement. I think we need to, as Dr. Rogers talked about, the old adage that those who do not study history are deemed to repeat it, right? And I think that's the thing, is that we have not, as a country, have not learned from our history. And that's the thing that we need to do. We need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to take, a very difficult, painful look at ourselves and our history. And then we need to have greater awareness. We need to educate with the intent of changing, our behaviors, our perceptions, dispelling, stereotypes, and really dismantling some of those things. And then engagement, we need to understand too, it's kind of dismantling, the model minority myth, as Dr. Raja had mentioned. I think that we need to, be able to look at that. And when I work with organizations, it's really, helping them to understand that, the most successful programs within organizations take individualized development plans, really looking at each employee as an individual, and as well as, particularly, those that are coming from, diverse backgrounds. I think that, and we can't, again, try to, perpetuate stereotypes as we have. But I think those are the things that I see that, are exciting and what we need to be doing. But it comes from a will, and a desire to really, want to change and address, some of these issues. And if the incidences of Asian American hate crimes and, discrimination haven't been compelling enough reasons, then we need to look again, very honestly and authentically at ourselves and, what are we doing to address those within our community?
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to ask our audience to drop any questions they have into the chat. And while you're dropping your questions into the chat, I'm going to allow Dr. Raja just a couple of minutes, sorry, we'll have to be brief, to respond to the same question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I just want to pick up on the thread of disaggregated data that was brought up by Dr. Wahl and Dr. Nguyen. So to bring it to sort of a micro level, what we don't know enough about theory related to Asian Americans. Every construct we have, whether it's developmental processes, attachment theory, mental health diagnosis, and assessment and treatment, really is based on samples of people that are not representative of Asian Americans. So we really do need more data, more research to inform how we assess people. And this, I think this transfers into the organizational level in terms of belonging. I think organizations really do need to foster a sense of belonging for Asian Americans within larger organizations. Really listen and hear. In my experiences, organizations have often dismissed or minimized the struggles of Asian Americans because we often present differently from other groups, and people often don't perceive us as having trouble or having any struggles. So I think really foster belonging through understanding how Asian Americans function in larger spaces.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Raja. So at this time, we are open to questions from the audience. I'm asking that you put them in the chat if you have any for our panelists. I don't know if there's any burning questions while you all are thinking of questions. I do have a couple for our panelists after listening to your presentations here. First of all, this might sound like a mundane question, but it's one that comes up in higher ed, especially in administrative circles, and it has to do with this disaggregation of data. And so this is going to sound like a silly question, but it's actually a serious one. When we use the term Asian American, who are we really referring to? And I say that because there's some question marks that come up around people who are, say, from what is politically incorrectly called the Middle East, being included in the category and then sometimes excluded. South Asians, there's talk about that needs to be disaggregated and not included. So I'd love to just hear a perspective on that, if anyone wants to jump in. Any thoughts from our panelists?
I can offer some insights. So I was Washington State a few years ago changed their racial categorizations and how they were collecting data in the K-12 districts. So the state mandated that K-12 districts disaggregate across all racial groups. So I was on the state commission to figure out what those groups, racial and ethnic groups, should be. So I'll give away the ending. There's no satisfactory list. And I think that there is no answer to that question because it has to be contextual. So for example, in Washington State, they had been collecting disaggregated Asian American Pacific Islander data for about 10 years. So we had a point of reference for figuring out, okay, some of these might be the groups that are represented, some of these might be smaller groups. But let's say, for example, within the Black racial group, the state had never collected disaggregated data. So there were no forms in which to say who would be represented or not represented by the final categorizations that were determined. And so the takeaways there, I think it's very context specific, but if you don't know your context, a number of the mechanisms that we took in order to better understand was we did community forums, and then we spoke with community organizers and community leaders to understand the ethno-racial groups who they represented. And then we recommended in the state report that the categorizations be revisited every 5 years, because as data is collected, you inevitably have to refine them, but also that means as immigrant groups changes, the demographics of our organizations and state changes, our categorizations should as well.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Nguyen. I think that's probably a good practice for all of the all of the categories that we currently use, that we should be reviewing those on a regular basis to see if the context and the nuance still fits, because those change over time. No, thank you. That was a great suggestion.
Oh, Allison, one more thing. Collect as much as you can, as many categories as you can. So for example, if there's a category, you're like, I'm not sure, maybe there's just one person or two people here, add it, because it doesn't add any time or any cost, especially now that our forms are oftentimes online or digital. The cost is no longer an excuse not to do it. And so I would say add as many categories if you're uncertain as you can.
Thank you. That's fantastic advice. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the affirmative action case that will be decided sometime this month, coming June. Curious thoughts and reactions to that. And I know that's a political hot potato, but this is going to be the conversation for the month of June. And that case will affect a number of higher education programs across the nation. What are your thoughts and perspectives about the affirmative action case, and how should people understand this? Because I think that we often hear a lot in the media, but there's little understanding that goes with that. Any thoughts from our panelists? So I think there's some challenges with that particular case that may affect, or at least some people believe will affect, other ethnic and minority groups. And I think this goes back to what you were sharing, Dr. Nguyen, is how do we, build community in light of different things that get argued in different legal places. And this isn't just necessarily about this affirmative action case. I can think of some other things. I'll give an example, tuition for Native Americans. And then there's other groups that wonder, well, what about us, and the like. So how do we in our spaces handle those kinds of conversations? What can we do?
Allison, I'll respond to that. I think back about my experience in the University of Oregon in the 70s. And we were at that time advocating for some of the original ethnic studies programs and getting more diversity of faculty, at the University of Oregon. And it was a time when all of the ethnic student unions, as they were called at that time, came together to advocate and actually did sit-ins and protests and things like that to try to further our cause. And it was a really exciting time to be on that campus. And, I thought about that, and that work later in the community as I was in Portland, really trying to, advance that work through the Japanese American Citizens League. And we were working with, the Black community and the Latino community, and we created, a lot of the Rainbow Coalition work and things like that. And it seemed that in many ways we've forgotten how to work together as community, that we were stronger together and we were able to advance a lot more work, when we were working collectively for a common vision, of trying to advance, that agenda. And we can understand why. You look at the divisions within the country, these days and everything too, and why that's come about. But it seems to me that within our communities, we need to be reaching out more. And I think that that's come about in a lot of different ways and around certain issues. But I think that one of the things is it's very easy to, look at the pie syndrome, right? And say that we got to get our piece of the pie, rather than taking a more holistic viewpoint and saying that there's enough for everyone, and that if we work together collectively, that we will really work to the benefit of our communities. And it's something that, I heard the former CEO of PolicyLink, Angela Blackwell, talk about one day, and she said that, and she was talking about targeted universalism, and she really talked about when we advance and we address the most pressing issues in our community that are really, impacting the most vulnerable in our communities, everyone benefits. And the primary example is curb cuts, in driveways. Now, they were originally, developed for, wheelchairs and things like that. But who did they unintentionally benefit? Babies, families with babies, right? What would you do, on these sidewalks and things like that if it hadn't been for the development of these curb cuts? So I like that approach that, when we look and lift up our communities and really look broadly at addressing, our communities, and again, disaggregating data and looking at, how do we really approach equity, then everyone benefits.
Thank you, Joe, for that response. I really liked the lifting up of coalition building and solidarity. And targeted universalism is actually a framework that we are implementing here in our DEI strategic plan. So I think you really spoke to some things that kind of bring that all together. Dr. Raja, do you have any comments to that? I know you had mentioned some things around solidarity and coalition building.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Wahl. I feel like we are getting so much more divided, and we're not reaching out to have dialogue and to understand. Again, I work primarily at the micro level, so I think there's a lot that can be done, especially with younger persons at the university level, to really encourage dialogue among different groups, compassionate, understanding dialogue that is really based on understanding, and not shame-based. And I think when we move towards the shame-based types of interventions, we do a lot of harm. And in terms of universities, I think we need to encourage more organizations to serve specifically the needs of Asian Americans, whether it's in Greek life, places where spaces can be created.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I see that Marjorie Wu has her hand up, and I'd like to go to Marjorie Wu. You'll need to unmute. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for this important conversation, because I have a couple of questions that is probably pretty remedial, in the sense that both could be for the three panelists or our audience here, because I am a first generation Asian coming to the US for college. And in my university in California, that we have 400 foreign students. And one of the ongoing conversation was we from various countries in Asia, India, China, Japan, and all of that. And we find that we come into this country to go to school versus the natural born Asians in this country have different attitudes about your origin, and also different attitudes and experiences about either discrimination or perceived. And we have ongoing conversation to say, well, but look around us, all the foreign students that were not born in the US seem to have a lot more self-confidence regardless who they are, versus that was born in the US, that you naturally kind of, either naturally or through experience, you sense that we're not treated equally, and that prejudice exists. Now, I really, this is a question I struggle for many years. Why is that? Is this institutional, or is it this the combination where our experience, that where we came from? So how, that's my question. Before going any further, this is a conversation that between me and my friends and me and my family.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Well, let's open this up to the panelists, and I just want to say that there was a question for books, recommended books, and if our panelists could also drop those into the chat, that would be helpful for colleagues. But let's answer the question that's been raised. Does anyone want to take a chance at that?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit, because I think I observed similar phenomenon as Dr. Wu is sharing. And I think it's a very complex issue, a very complicated issue. And I think it has to do with a variety of experiences, both at the individual level, family level, as well as societal level. And again, because I practice from a micro level, I tend to see things in terms of identity development. And I think when people are raised in their countries of origin, there's just much more cohesion as far as the messaging, the lessons they're learning. It kind of all fits together, their daily practices, time with their family, and then they see everybody around them also sort of experiencing very similar types of things. And I think when we come to the United States, those of us that are born here, there's such a variety of experiences that we're having, again, at multiple micro and macro levels. And I think it really contributes to a different type of journey in terms of developing our own identity and our confidence and self-esteem.
Any of our other panelists want to weigh in on that question? Thank you, Dr. Raja. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Raja. I think that some of the earlier comments, that were made too about, existing in two worlds. I think for the Asian American, in the United States, particularly those of us that were born here, it is very much a dualistic, identity that we, kind of live in. There's many of times, if our parents are immigrants themselves, there's their world, and then the world that we're living in and existing in, going to school with, all of our American friends and everything like that. And I know when I was growing up, it was my sister and I didn't want anything to do with Japanese food, right? And so my poor mother would have to wait till like nighttime when we were in bed to eat Japanese food, because my sister and I wanted to be, all American and eat, McDonald's hamburgers and French fries and everything like our kids. And so I was so embarrassed if my mom gave me a bento to take to school for lunch and everything. Nowadays, my grandkids think it's the coolest thing in the world to do. But in those days, we were so much, enamored with trying to become Americanized, that we were trying to kind of overdo the enculturation. And yeah, I think it goes, both ways, but I think that's that dual nature of things that, we're coming to grips with, and how it fuels, as Dr. Raja knows too, so many of the mental health issues, when you don't have that, cultural grounding of who you are. And that's, one of the things I loved about with my grandkids. I watched that Disney movie, Moana, right? And I love that song at the end, who you are, right? And for so many of us who grew up, particularly those of us that are biracial, there is so much of a question of who are we, are we our parents' children, or do we come from, mom and dad, and who are the genealogy now with all of the, ancestry.com and things. But it really fundamentally comes down to, who you feel you are inside, and how you operate and in the world that really sets that, I think, forward. But yeah. Great question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wu. That's a wonderful question. We are at time, everyone. I really want to thank our panelists. A question was dropped into the chat about what books you would recommend. Dr. Nguyen has dropped in the chat some amazing books. And I know we don't have any more time left, but what I will do is follow up with our guests here for books or journals that you would recommend, since this is a graduate research university, and we will share that with our fielding community, because I think there is a strong interest in this particular area and topic. Thank you so much for making this a meaningful conversation for AAPI Heritage Month. We hope to have you back sometime again with some more updates. One last question quickly. Are you all comfortable with us sharing your email addresses if we have students or others interested in pursuing research or questions with you? Okay, I
That
see.
sounds great.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Fielding community. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Allison.